There's a smell that lives somewhere in the back of memory. Sawdust on a wooden floor, the cool breath of a refrigerated case, and something sweet and slightly waxy, like wax paper wrapped around a cut of beef. If you walked into a certain kind of store in the 1950s or early 1960s, that smell hit you before you even reached the counter. And somehow, decades later, it's still there, still waiting. Grocery shopping wasn't an errand back then. It was a whole experience, an event with its own rhythm, its own cast of characters, its own small rituals that most families followed without ever naming them. You didn't just grab what you needed and go. There was a sequence to it, a way things were done. And if you were a child tagging along, gripping the side of a cart, or following close to an adult's heels, you absorbed all of it without realizing you were storing it away for life. This isn't about comparing then to now. It's about going back inside that store, really going back, and letting the details come up the way they do sometimes when a particular light hits a certain way, or you catch a fragment of a song on the radio. There are a handful of things from those years that we haven't quite talked about the way they deserve to be talked about. So let's take the time. Let's actually be there. The first thing worth understanding is that for most families in the 1950s, grocery shopping wasn't necessarily one big weekly haul. It was, for many households, a more frequent affair, sometimes every 2 or 3 days, sometimes daily, depending on where you lived and what you could store at home. Refrigerators existed, of course, but they were smaller, and not every family had a car big enough, or a car at all, to make it practical to bring home 7 days of food in one go. So the store was a place you returned to, a place that knew you. That familiarity is worth pausing on because it shaped everything. The butcher behind the counter knew what cut your mother preferred. The woman at the register had probably watched you grow an inch since she saw you last. In smaller towns especially, the grocery store was woven into the social fabric in a way that's genuinely hard to explain to someone who didn't experience it. It wasn't a transaction. It was a visit. Picture the butcher counter, not a refrigerated display case you peer through alone and then press a button for a number, but a real counter staffed by a man in a white apron who would look up when you approached, nod, and ask what you needed. He'd reach back and bring out the cut, hold it up for inspection, and wait while your mother decided if the marbling looked right. This was the standard interaction. You didn't just pick up pre-wrapped meat off a shelf. You had a conversation about the meat. He might wrap it himself in white paper, fold the ends over with practiced ease, and tie it with a loop of string. And that small package, that neat white bundle, somehow made the whole thing feel more considered. More like something was being prepared rather than purchased. We'll come back to that string. Because it turns out string was everywhere, and not just at the butcher's. The produce section, or what passed for one in many stores of that era, was often a more modest affair than what we're used to. Seasonal meant seasonal. You didn't get strawberries in December. You didn't expect mangoes or avocados at the corner market in a mid-sized American or Canadian city in 1957. What you got was what was grown nearby, what had come in that week, what was sitting in a wooden crate or a shallow bin for you to pick through. And that picking through was its own ritual, squeezing an apple gently, lifting a tomato and turning it in the light, checking the bottom of a peach for soft spots. People had opinions about produce, real, considered opinions. Your grandmother probably had a system. The canned goods aisle is where things got a little more modern feeling, and for kids, a little more exciting, because canned goods had labels, colorful ones. And those labels were often the most vivid, eye-catching graphics you'd see in an average week that wasn't a comic book. Del Monte, Green Giant, Campbell's. The labels were practically designed for children to stare at. There's something about the way a can of tomato soup looked in that era, the red and white, the bold serif font, that became almost totemic. You knew it. You trusted it. It felt like a promise. Keep that thought about labels in mind. There's a reason they mattered so much beyond just looking nice. Let's talk about the cart for a moment, because the grocery cart of the 1950s and 60s was not quite what we roll around today. For one thing, they were often smaller. For another, they had a particular sound, a squeak, or a rattle, or that specific low rumble on linoleum that you could hear from across the store. Carts were a relatively recent invention at the time. The first shopping cart had only been introduced in the late 1930s, so they were still, in the post-war years, something of a novelty in the larger sense. Some smaller stores didn't have them at all. You carried a basket, a real basket, sometimes made of metal wire, sometimes a wicker thing that hooked over your forearm. Imagine being 6 or 7 years old and being handed one of those metal wire baskets to carry. It was a serious responsibility. You held the groceries. You didn't complain that it was getting heavy, and you certainly didn't leave it in the aisle where someone could trip over it. There were rules, even for children, even in the grocery store. Maybe especially there. Now picture a late weekday morning. The store isn't crowded. Fluorescent light hums overhead, that specific pale brightness that made every surface look slightly more official. A woman in a house dress and low heels pushes a cart slowly down the cereal aisle. A small boy follows at her hip, one hand resting on the cart's edge. She stops, reads a label, puts the box back. He watches. At the end of the aisle, there's a cardboard display for something new, a product being promoted, maybe a cereal with a prize inside, or a new brand of crackers in a blue box. He stares at it. She doesn't turn. He knows better than to ask yet. The timing of asking was its own skill. That timing, the reading of the moment, the understanding that there was a right way to approach a request, was something children learned in grocery stores. It sounds small. It wasn't small. One of the things that made those stores feel so particular was the scale of individual service that existed in places we don't usually associate with personal attention. The deli counter, if the store had one, operated the same way as the butcher. You waited your turn. You stated your request clearly, and the person behind the counter took care of it. Half a pound of bologna, sliced thin. A quarter pound of American cheese. Sometimes they'd lay a piece on the counter for you to taste before they continued. That tasting, that small courtesy, assumed that your opinion mattered, that you were someone with a preference worth accommodating. It's a tiny thing, but multiply it by every trip, every week, every year of a childhood, and it adds up to something. There's a moment worth recreating here, because it captures something essential about the evening of a grocery shopping day. Imagine coming home with the bags, paper bags handled carefully because they could tear, and spreading the contents out on the kitchen table or the counter to be put away. There was an order to it. Canned goods went to the back of the pantry, newer ones behind the older ones. Bread went in the bread box. Milk went immediately in the refrigerator, and the meat, in that white paper package tied with string, went in on a specific shelf, already mentally claimed for Thursday's dinner or Sunday's roast. The unpacking wasn't a chore people rushed through. It was the continuation of the trip, the closing of the loop. Someone, usually the woman of the house in that era, surveyed what had come in and already knew what the week's meals would look like. The groceries weren't random. They were a plan. The string from the butcher package often got saved. That's not a detail that appears in many accounts of the era, but it happened in enough households that it deserves a mention. Bits of string went into a drawer or were wound around a ball of accumulated string that lived in the kitchen. Same with rubber bands. Same with paper bags folded flat and tucked beside the refrigerator. The generation that had lived through the Depression or raised children just after it did not throw away things that still had use. and a length of good, strong butcher's string had use. Now here's something that might surprise you. In many neighborhoods during this era, you didn't have to go to the store at all for certain things. The store sometimes came to you. The milkman is the most famous example, of course. Those glass bottles on the doorstep before dawn, the high-pitched clink of them being set down, the way the cream floated at the top in cold weather. But there was also, in various parts of the US, Canada, and Australia, the bread man, the egg man, the ice cream truck, which was a mobile store unto itself. Vendors who worked set routes, knew their customers, and in some cases had standing orders that never needed to be spoken aloud. They simply arrived every Tuesday with what you'd always taken, and you settled up at the end of the month. The end of the month. That phrase points to something important about how many families managed their household economy in this era: the store tab. Running a tab at the local grocer, buying what you needed, and settling the account at the end of the week or month was common enough that it had its own social weight. If you ran a tab, you had a relationship with that store. The store had extended you trust, and the expectation was that you honored it. Children understood, even without being told explicitly, that certain things, behavior in the store, the honesty of what was requested, had implications beyond the moment. The tab represented the family's word. There's a quiet humor to some of the rules that governed grocery store behavior in those years. Take the unspoken architecture of who walked in front. In many families, the adult led, obviously, but there was also an understanding about children and displays. Certain things were put at child eye level on purpose, even then, because the people designing store layouts understood perfectly well that a child who spotted a box of sugar pops was going to become an advocate for sugar pops. The counterplay in many families was a look, just a look. You've seen that look. Maybe you received it. The look that meant, I see that you see it, and the answer is no, and we don't need to discuss it further. The answer was almost always no, and yet somehow, on a birthday or after a particularly good report card, or for no real reason at all except that the parent felt generous on a given Tuesday, sometimes the answer was yes. And the yes, being rare, was enormous. A small box of animal crackers, a pack of gum, a single candy bar chosen with the seriousness of a real decision. These were not small pleasures, they were events. Let's step outside for a moment, because grocery shopping in those decades often had an outdoor dimension that's been mostly lost. Many neighborhoods had a kind of grocery ecosystem, not one supermarket, but several smaller, specialized shops within walking distance of each other. The greengrocer, the butcher, the bakery with the bread already warm in the morning, steaming through the paper bag when you carried it home. A fishmonger, if you were near a coast. Maybe a small general store for dry goods. The weekly or bi-weekly shop might involve walking a circuit of several of these places, each with its own smell and its own personality. Kids who grew up in cities, in parts of New York, Chicago, London, Sydney, knew this circuit the way they knew the route to school. Left at the corner, past the hardware store, in at the greengrocer where Mr. Papadopoulos always set aside the good tomatoes, then across to the bakery, then home. That walk home, bags distributed between hands, the weight shifting on your arms, the warm bread smell mixing with the cold air. That was its own small experience, something you could feel in your shoulders for the rest of the afternoon. And then there's the supermarket. The actual supermarket of the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the newer, bigger, brighter stores that were being built in the suburbs as families moved outward and cars became standard. These were different. These were almost grand. Wide aisles, music playing overhead, and not muzak in the slightly ironic sense we think of now, but actual cheerful, bouncy pop music that made the space feel alive. Display cases that were fully refrigerated, a whole aisle of frozen foods, which were still novel enough to feel like something from the future. TV dinners in their foil trays, frozen orange juice concentrate, fish sticks. The frozen food aisle specifically had a quality that made children stop walking. The cold air that drifted out when someone opened one of those long, glass-topped freezer cases, that sudden breath of winter, visible for just a second, was deeply, specifically memorable. Kids leaned over to feel it on their faces. Adults reached in quickly and grabbed what they needed. But that cold, that unexpected cold in the middle of a warm store, stuck in the mind. Now, here's the thread about labels that was worth keeping. Because in that era, before television advertising had fully taken hold for every product, and before most families had color TV, even if they had any TV at all, the label on a can or a box was often your primary encounter with a brand's personality. The illustration on a can of Green Giant corn, the giant himself, cheerful and enormous, standing in his valley, was more vivid and detailed than many things a child saw in the average day. You looked at it. You thought about it. The character on the cream of wheat box, the Quaker on the oatmeal, the Campbell kids. These weren't just logos. They were practically neighbors. You knew them, which explains something about the loyalty families had to certain brands that can seem irrational from the outside. It wasn't irrational. It was a relationship built through repeated visual contact, through the can that always tasted right, through the memory of seeing your mother reach for that specific box without hesitation. Brand loyalty in that era was personal in a way that had nothing to do with marketing strategy and everything to do with routine and repetition, and the quiet comfort of a thing being reliably itself. There's something worth sitting with in how the checkout line worked in this era, particularly in smaller stores. In a full-service store, meaning one where a clerk at the register handled your items, the transaction was face-to-face and verbal. You didn't unload your cart onto a belt and watch it disappear through a scanner. The clerk might lift each item, call out the price, and add it up by hand, or on a register that made a satisfying mechanical ka-chunk with every key pressed. In many stores, especially through the early 60s, the clerk would read back the total from a paper tape, make change carefully from the till, and hand it to you with both hands, or count it back into your palm the old way, the way that meant you always knew exactly what you'd received. That counting back of change is something worth noticing because it represented a kind of mutual accountability. The clerk didn't just hand you a fistful of coins. They narrated, "That's $1.47, 53 cents change, so $2. Both of you knew the math had been done. It was a tiny ceremony of honesty repeated 100 times a day in every store in the country. Children who watched this, and they were always watching, learned something about transactions being accountable, about money being real and specific, about the expectation that both parties to an exchange would pay attention. Some families kept a little notebook for the grocery list. Maybe your household did. A small spiral notebook or just a folded piece of paper kept in a kitchen drawer between trips. The list was usually maintained by whoever did most of the cooking, and it accumulated through the week. A jar of something noticed to be running low, jotted down before it was forgotten. An ingredient for something planned for next week. The list was an artifact of the household's life. In some houses, it was kept in handwriting so specific and personal that you could tell at a glance who had written each entry. There's an evening memory that belongs here. Late in the week, after dinner, someone sits at the kitchen table under the lamp and goes through the cupboards mentally or physically to make the final list for the next day's shopping. The kitchen is quiet except for the tick of the clock and maybe the distant sound of the television in the other room. Outside, it might be dark already. The lamp makes a warm pool on the table. The notebook is small and the handwriting is careful. This is not a dramatic moment. It is a completely ordinary moment, and it is, for exactly that reason, one of the things that holds a particular place in memory. The ordinariness of it, the sense of a household running itself by small, repeated acts of attention. The smell of those stores deserves its own moment, because smell is memory's most direct path. Every store had a base smell, a combination of its wood or linoleum floor, its refrigeration units, the particular cleaning product used on the counters, and the accumulated scent of everything that had been sold there over the years. Some stores smelled primarily of their deli case, that sharp, pleasantly salty smell of cured meat and cheese. Some smelled of floor wax and cardboard. Bakeries within larger stores filled the whole space with something warm and yeasty that made it harder to leave. The produce section in summer had a green, bright smell. In autumn, apples. The corner where coffee was sold, and in those years, coffee was often ground fresh in the store, in a machine right there by the bags, smelled of something dark and adult that children found simultaneously fascinating and slightly alarming. There's a particular phenomenon that people who shopped in this era sometimes describe. The way that stores seemed to be quieter. Not silent, there was plenty of noise, but the absence of the specific noise that came later, the constant beeping of scanners, the mechanical voice reading out totals, the background roar of a store serving 1,000 customers at once, meant that human voices carried differently. You could hear conversations in adjacent aisles. You could hear the click of someone's heels on the floor 2 sections over. You could hear the butcher talking to the customer ahead of you, and by the time you reached the counter, he might already know something about your family's week. Let's go outside one more time, because the parking lot of a late 1950s supermarket is its own scene. If the store had a lot, and the newer suburban stores did, it was smaller and simpler than what we navigate today. Fewer cars, more space between them. Kids sometimes waited in the car while a parent ran in for 1 or 2 things, which was a different experience than it sounds. Sitting in a parked car, watching other people come and go, the store's glass windows reflecting the sky. Nothing to do but wait and watch and think. This was considered normal, expected, unremarkable. The car was warm from the sun. You fogged the window with your breath and drew in it. There were specific things that happened near the end of a grocery trip that functioned almost like a reward system, unofficial, unspoken, but reliable. In some stores, there was a gumball machine near the door. 1 penny and a globe of something impossibly colored emerged into your palm. In others, the checkout clerk might slip a small treat to a well-behaved child, a little ritual of approval that felt enormous when you were the child receiving it. And there was always the anticipation of what was being carried home, the specific items on the list that you'd been looking forward to, or the thing that might appear on tomorrow's plate. Here's what none of this captures fully, but what's worth trying to name. The sense that grocery shopping in those years was embedded in a web of human relationships that gave it weight beyond its function. The butcher knew your mother's name. The woman at the register had opinions about the weather. The greengrocer gave slightly better tomatoes to the customers he liked. These relationships weren't transactional in the cold sense. They were actual social tissue, small threads connecting households to the neighborhood they lived in, 1 weekly visit at a time. That's not nostalgia for a simpler time. It's an observation about scale. These stores existed at a human scale, a scale at which one person could be known by another, where service was personal because the economy of it allowed for that, where a child could be seen and acknowledged and learn from watching how adults moved through a shared space with courtesy and patience. The other side of it, and there's always another side, is that the world those stores existed in was also a more limited one. Not every family could afford every item. Not every neighborhood had the same quality of store. The personal relationships that felt so warm could also feel exclusionary if you were new to a neighborhood, or looked different, or had an accent that marked you as an outsider. The ease of those stores was real for the people who felt easy in them. For others, the same interaction across the same counter could feel different. That's worth holding alongside the warmth. Both things were true at once. And yet, the tactile experience, the actual physical experience of being in those stores, was something that left an impression that transcended the social context. The weight of a paper bag, the specific squeak of a particular floorboard near the dairy case, the way the lighting shifted slightly cooler toward the back of the store, the sound of prices being stamped on cans by the stock boy with his pricing gun, a sound like a quiet, rapid percussion, the moment of relief when the math at the register came out to what you'd expected, and the envelope of grocery money, kept separate from the regular wallet, designated specifically for this purpose, yielded exactly the right amount. So here's a question, and it's the kind that has no wrong answer. If you went grocery shopping as a child in this era, what was the one thing in the store you always hoped you'd get to stop and look at? Not necessarily something you were allowed to have, just something that drew your eye every time, that you made a small, private ritual of noticing. Maybe it was a display of something colorful near the door. Maybe it was a specific aisle that smelled a certain way. Maybe it was watching the butcher work. Whatever it is, that memory is yours, and it's specific to you. And that's exactly what makes it worth thinking about. And here's the other question, for those of you who were adults during this era. Who did the shopping? Who managed the list? Who knew the weight of feeding a family on a specific budget and making it work? What was the store you went to most often, and what made it yours? Was it the people behind the counter? The layout you knew by heart? The thing they stock that no other store did? These details don't disappear. They live in the people who carry them. If this kind of careful, specific walk back through the years feels like something worth doing more of, it might be worth staying around for where this goes next. There's more to revisit that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. The grocery store of the 1950s and 60s was a place that did something beyond selling food. It organized the week. It placed families in relationship with their neighborhood. It gave children a context for understanding how adults moved through the world, patiently, with attention, following small, unspoken rules that held everything in its proper shape. And it left behind a set of sensory memories so specific and so layered that decades later, the right smell or the right sound can put you back inside it completely. Back at the front of the store, the door swings open. The smell arrives first. Sawdust, refrigeration, something sweet and slightly waxy. The light is pale and steady. Somewhere behind the counter, someone knows your family's name. You're here. You're actually back inside it, if only for a moment. And somehow, that moment is enough.